Good evening. Welcome to Reflections on Granby. My name is Mike Malloy, and I'll be your host this evening. Today's date is August 4th, 2012. Our guest tonight is Daniel Putnam Brown. People around town will know him as Putt. That's what he likes to go by. He was born on April 1st, 1943, and he's been a resident of Granby since 1969 on Broad Hill Road in Granby. Mm-hmm. Thanks for joining us, Putt.
West Granby. Thank you very much, Ron.
West Granby. I'm sorry. I always forget in Granby. They're kind of sensitive about the...
Well, there's North Granby, Granby, and West Granby.
Okay, so why don't we start out where we do with everyone, which is where were you born?
I was born in Evanston, Illinois.
Okay.
And according to my mother, by the time I graduated from college, I lived in 32 houses.
Wow.
So in Illinois, I lived in Evanston, Skokie, Wilmette, Winnetka, Kenilworth, Lake Forest, and Peoria.
Okay.
And the reason for that was that my father was in the Navy.
Okay.
And after that, he was a salesman for U.S. Steel. And U.S. Steel would move furniture for you, but wouldn't guarantee the resale of a house.
Okay.
And we knew that he'd be transferred a lot, so we had to move into a rental house in the best school district.
Okay.
So that meant, for instance, when I was in high school, I did go to the same regional high school in Illinois.
Right.
But we lived in 3 different towns within that township.
So knowing you guys basically had a strategy of best location. I mean, your parents had to find a good school district. They knew you were moving. They just wanted you in the best place possible.
We needed the combination of a rental house in the best school district. So somebody might be in Europe for 8 months, and so we'd live in that house.
Okay.
And then we'd move someplace else.
So what was that? That's a fairly unique. I mean, it seemed that people that rented in that day, it wasn't as uncommon as it is today to move that often, I think. Although some people move year to year now. But I think there was a lot of that then. I mean, there was a lot of people that would shift their look. We've had a few guests on that mentioned that. What was that like? What was that experience?
Well, what it means is that I don't have any friends from those early schools.
Okay.
My grandmother lived on Martha's Vineyard.
Okay.
And she lived there full time.
Wow.
That's really where her family comes from originally. And so that was my emotional home.
Okay.
So in the summertime, we'd go to her. So all of my early friends are friends that I made while I was in Martha's Vineyard.
So that was the one anchor in your life.
That was the one anchor in my life. And
Okay.
it established so many of the values and things that I do.
What was Martha's Vineyard was quite different back then, was it not? It was.
It was. Yeah. Well, I think being part of a family that lives there
Right.
Made it a little bit different. There was a little yacht club that I was very active in. It was a tiny little thing, but it had extraordinarily good sailors. So that was part of what my life was all about in the early days.
Well, it's pretty protected. The vineyard has been fairly protected in many ways. So I guess in some ways it hasn't changed a lot.
Certainly in the off season, it's the same as it always has been.
Right.
And in the summer, there's a great onslaught of people. My sister now lives in the family house there full time.
Okay.
We don't go a whole lot to visit her in the summertime. Okay. But we love it there in the off season.
Yeah, it's like being in a nature preserve almost when you go up there. So so you grew up in a variety of different places. What are some of the memories of your school years? I mean, obviously you moved a lot. So anything that is striking that you find?
I guess the thing that I remember most are my early times at my grandmother's house in Martha's Vineyard. It was a 1720 house that had been moved from off island to the island in the 19th century. Well, what they did was they simply knocked out the pegs. It was a timber frame construction.
Right.
So you take off the siding and you have this structure that can be taken apart like Lincoln logs.
Right.
So apparently it was moved to Martha's Vineyard, and that's where I grew up, really, in that house. And it had, wonderful early features that that were just great.
So your real focus as a youngster was Martha's Vineyard. I mean, that's your clearest memory.
Well, certainly that was my emotional focus.
Yeah.
Sure.
Now, where on the vineyard did you live? I mean, what was the actual town that you had?
In Vineyard Haven.
Okay.
Which is on the north side of the island.
It's where the ferry comes in.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so that must have been pretty bucolic as a youngster to be able to go there.
It was great.
Yeah.
It was great. And one of my grandmother's great friends was a retired Army general.
Okay.
And he was very proud of the fact that he had military people, generals and others going back to the Revolutionary War. And I can remember going into his house, and on the wall framed was a little invitation signed by George Washington inviting a Lieutenant Ennis
No kidding.
to a function of some sort. And they had, the Ennises came from Newport.
Okay.
And I remember that they had a really spectacular Newport highboy, which was in a dining room. And we would typically go into the living room and have these meetings. And I can remember when I was 8 years old or 7 years old, just going into the dining room and standing in front of this magnificent highboy. I had no idea what it was, except that I just loved it.
Right.
It was a bonnet-topped highboy with slipper feet, and kind of the classic thing that you see in museums now. I think that's been inherited by other people in the Ennis family. Old General Ennis has died. So I remember all of those experiences. He also was the one that taught me how to sail. I mean, you would think that an Army general wouldn't be a good sailor, but he was, and he had a catboat, which I loved. He also taught me how to shoot. So, and he had a whole bunch of military weapons, which he had collected over the years, and he taught me how to field strip them. I could take apart a semi-automatic pistol faster than you could blink.
So it sounds like quite a fun guy.
We learned how to shoot those and how to respect guns.
Right. It's quite a fun guy to have in the neighborhood as a youngster. Yeah.
He was great.
Really helped round out the summer.
And he was full of all sorts of stories.
So what did your parents do? Your father was in the
my
Navy.
father was a salesman for U.S. Steel. My mother was very active in various kinds of community endeavors.
Okay. So just getting back to your dad, what you mentioned he was in the Navy, right, initially?
He was in the Navy in the Second World War, and then a little bit after that, too.
Okay. So why was he moving so much as a salesman for U.S. Steel? They put you where they needed you? Is that
He was a tin plate specialist, and so every time American Can or Continental Can or any other big user of tin plate would establish a new factory or a new line,
right,
inevitably my father would get transferred there for 2 or 3 years, and during those 2 or 3 years then we might move around.
Okay.
So I can remember a couple of places outside of Pittsburgh, which is where U.S. Steel was located,
right,
where we lived, and then we lived in a couple of places in Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia.
Okay, so where did you actually graduate from? Where did you...
Well, I went to New Trier High School, which is a big township high school in Winnetka, Illinois.
Okay.
That served, I think, as I recall, 6 towns. I had 1,100 people in my graduating class.
That was the era of big schools, so they had some...
Well, it still is. I mean, it's one of these very, very large regional high schools that you tend to find in the Midwest in particular. And then I went to Williams College in northwestern Massachusetts.
Okay.
And then I went to Yale Law School, and then I moved here.
Okay. So you got your degree in law.
Right.
What was your original degree?
History.
History. Okay.
And I thought I'd be a history teacher.
Did you really?
Everybody assumed that I would be a history teacher. But I never really got around to applying. And finally, in my senior year, I finally scheduled something for February 4th of my senior year, 1965. And Yale was the place to go. I thought, for what I wanted to do.
Right.
So I went down, took a bus, got into Yale, got into the dean of the history department's office, and he looked up and said, "Now, Mr. Brown, if you're admitted, when do you hope to come?"
Right.
And I said, "This September, sir." And he said, "Well, now, Mr. Brown, we closed our applications on January 31st. Don't you think it would be a disservice to those people that took enough interest in our program to learn of our deadlines if we continue this conversation anymore?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I do." And
Pretty serious fellow.
And was out on my ear in about as long as it takes to tell that short story.
Wow.
The bus back to Pittsfield, which is near Williamstown,
Right.
was at 4:30, and I had no idea what I was going to do now.
Right.
So I wandered around.
Kind of threw your plans in the hopper
Totally.
there.
Well, you know, I wanted to go to Yale and no other place because I wanted to study meringue, and people started streaming around. So I followed a group of them into this big conference room, and it turned out it was the law school.
Okay.
And I sat and I listened to what was going on there, and I thought, well, this is very interesting. I'll apply here. So I went home and had exactly, a week to sign up for the law boards, and Yale was coming to Williams to.
So they hadn't closed the registration for law school yet.
Just
Okay, right.
literally by days, I was
Wow.
able to do it.
Huh.
And so
It was kind of an
became-
accident, really.
totally an accident.
Yeah. Wow.
And yet I loved it. And the dean was completely right. If I'd been set to be a distinguished history scholar at Yale, I would have known everything about it. I mean, you
Right.
can't expect to do well in anything if you are as haphazard and lackadaisical
Well,
as
you were
that.
young too.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I know what you're saying. You would have been ultra focused.
But he was right, and there was
Yeah.
no reason why he should have bothered with me.
Right. When there were people that
A whole
had
line of people
waiting
so-
6 months just to
Yeah.
apply. Yeah. That's a valid point, I guess. If you're going to go to Yale and you're going to be at the top of the academic world in many ways, then you'd
Right.
expect a certain focus. Yeah. So okay, so you were that was the early '60s.
Right.
So you went
65.
mid '60s. So it's 1965. You enter Yale Law School.
Yep.
And what was that like? That was a pretty raucous time in the country. The war was going on.
Well, I guess I was somewhat distracted at Yale. First of all, I was getting ready to be married to my wife, now Nanny.
Okay.
And I also had sailed in one of the America's Cup races in 1964 when I was still in college.
Okay.
So I was going to be in a second one between my first and second years in law school. So the first year, I spent an awful lot of time either training or sailing. I did perfectly well in law school.
Yeah.
Somehow, I'm not quite sure why. But I basically was sailing 5 days a week from March 1st until maybe October 1st when the races were over.
Now, how did that come about? How did you get? Did that happen through the vineyard? A connection with sailing?
Well, sort of.
Yeah.
The little yacht club that I described had a very distinguished record.
Okay.
And they had produced a number of people who had gone to the Olympics and had won national championships. And
Okay.
some friends of mine and I had been in a race in 1964, or 63, I guess, which we weren't expected to do well in at all.
Okay.
And we won it going away. And as we were sort of celebrating in whatever the late or early 60s equivalents of high fives was,
Yes.
everybody said, we were so good, we should be in the America's Cup. And everybody laughed about that. And I thought to myself, well, I should be in the America's Cup.
Okay.
That makes perfectly good sense.
Why not, right?
So I wrote a letter. And I had, it was a 4-page letter that had everything that I had ever done in my life that could impress them, from
Right.
my sailing credentials to my swimming times,
Right,
or
right.
whatever.
Okay, yeah.
And I thought, well, I'll just throw everything in because maybe something will catch their attention.
Right. It's a good approach.
And I got a letter back saying, Dear Mr. Brown, we have 385 or some number like that applicants for the final slot on the crew. Your chances certainly aren't very good, but if you would like to come and talk to us during your Thanksgiving vacation, let us know and we'll make arrangements. So I thought, well, this is really great. I'm going to go down and I'm going to meet people who are in this
The zenith.
this elite sailing group. Even if I don't get the job, and of course I won't, at least I'll have a wonderful experience.
Right.
So I went down, and I was supposed to meet at noon. And I knocked on the door of the New York Yacht Club, which is where we were supposed to meet, and nobody answered the door. And finally, after a couple of minutes, a workman opened the door and said, "Will you stop pounding on that door? We're closed for renovations." I said, "Well, I've got what
Got
do
an
you mean?"
appointment.
At that point, there was a limousine on the curb, right on the other side of the sidewalk, and the chauffeur lowered the window and said, "Mr. Brown, please get in."
Oh, really?
And so
you
we
knew
went,
you were in a different world at that point.
Well, I did, and so we went to the New York Racket Club, which was a place where I had never been.
Right.
And we had the head of the syndicate, the tactician, and the skipper there. So I was delighted. And we were in this room, and we ordered our lunch. And as we were talking, the got up and started walking out of the room. I thought, well, this is really not going well. It turns out that at the New York Racket Club, at that time, you order your lunch in one room, and then when your lunch is served at your table, somebody says,
So they were just going to get their food.
"Mr. Malloy, your table is ready." And I didn't know that. So as they walked across the room, there I was sitting thinking, apparently I've said
They're
something
fleeing the
awful. But it all worked out, and at the end of the day,
So you got the gig.
I got the gig, but I didn't learn that for a couple months.
Okay, so they went through the whole application.
Yeah.
So that must have been quite an experience. So that's one of those things that only youth would endeavor. You know what I mean?
Oh, it was
You
great.
just fill out the
That's how I
applications.
met my wife Nanny lived in Newport at that time.
You know, that's what I was trying to get back to here.
Uh-huh.
Where did you? Because you mentioned her. Now, so you met Nanny training for the nanny?
Well, when I was in 1964, I was on an earlier crew. Well, I was on that crew. I
Right.
ended up doing it twice, and there was a function, and I was alone, and I saw this woman or girl who I just was fascinated with. Although I'd never met her, didn't know anything about her,
Right.
but I just could not take my eyes off of her. She just was animated and fascinating. And for 45 minutes, I sort of wandered around pretending that I was looking at other things, but when she wasn't looking in my direction, I would just feast on her with my eyes.
Right.
And I said to myself, I'm going to marry her.
Wow. Huh.
Why I had the conceit to think that I would be able to do that.
Well, you just got accepted
I don't know.
to sail in the America's Cup.
So I went back and I named my winch on the boat Nanny.
Yes. Okay.
And people thought, but I was also extraordinarily shy. So people thought that it would be good if I met Nanny.
Right.
So they kept trying to introduce me. One time I remember we were at this club that had a swimming pool on one of our off days, and Nanny was over there, and John Handel, who was on our crew, said, Putter, which is another name that people call me. That all my old sailing friends call me Putter. Said, Putter, Nanny, you've got to meet her. She's over there. You stay here. I'm going to go get her and bring her over here.
Right.
So as he turned his back, I jumped in the pool. I was a swimmer in
Right.
college, and I was a backstroker. And of course, when you're a backstroker, you can swim along and look around.
Right.
So John and Nanny came over looking for me. It never occurred to them to look down and see me swimming around in the pool, right?
So you got a little shy and disappeared.
I disappeared.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I asked her after our boat was selected to defend the cup. There was a great ball at the breakers, and out of the blue, I called her up and asked her to go to it. And
It's kind of a fairy tale meeting, isn't it?
Oh, it's
Not many
wonderful.
people meet their wife at the breakers,
well, that was our first date.
or actually have their first date. Yeah, that's quite an experience. Okay, so you're romancing your wife to be. You're starting Yale, and you've just sailed in the America's Cup. That's quite a heady start to a young man's.
Of course, at the time, it doesn't seem
No.
particularly heady. It was
No.
just sort of what I was doing at that particular time.
What was?
I loved law school, though,
Did you? Yeah.
particularly when finally Nanny and I did marry,
Okay.
and we lived in a little house in the Woodmont section of Milford, which is about 15 or 20 minutes away,
Okay.
and it was great.
Now, just because it's such a unique experience, it's not going to be really unique, but sailing in the America's Cup, why don't you tell our audience what that was all about? What did you do?
Well, the first time I was two things, depending upon what the particular assignment was that day.
Right.
I was either a coffee grinder, which, as you know, there are these winches that you turn like
That's
this.
what I had a picture in my mind when you said that, yeah.
I was the youngest one on the crew, so, and probably was one of the fittest at that time.
Okay.
That was 50-some years ago,
Yeah.
so I'm not nearly that fit anymore. But at the time, I was fit. And when I wasn't doing the tailor, which means that I was the one that takes the line off of the winch.
Okay.
So I would call that something, as a tailor, you call that something needs to be trimmed, and then the coffee grinder turns the winch and you pull it in or let it
It's a
out.
very intricate process, the work between the crew. I mean, it's
It is.
Yeah.
And the better the crew is, the less talking there is. You know, everybody knows exactly what they're going to do, and you know just who to look at any particular time. It's a wonderful feeling.
It's like a
And then
Swiss
the
watch.
sec-
It's like a watch, kind of
It is.
pieces
It
coming
is.
together, yeah.
And the second time, I did it again in 1967 when I was in law school. That time I trimmed the spinnaker
Okay.
on.
So where does the race start? What do you actually do?
It's in Newport.
So you start in Newport in the harbor. You all set out at the
Well,
same time.
it's not in the harbor. First of all, there are a whole series of races leading up to the America's Cup.
Qualifying.
So each side, the Americans, I can't remember in '64 and '67 how many challengers there were, but say there were 5 or 6 challengers,
Okay.
which they're all vying to be the defender.
So there's only one person, one crew
Only one crew.
that sails on behalf of the United States.
Right.
Wow, that's
It's a match race.
Wow.
So in the final analysis, you have a bunch of American boats that are racing against each other in a series of elimination races.
Okay.
And then there are, in this case, in 1964, we were racing against the British. So there were boats on the British side who were competing. And at the end of all of that competition, then it becomes a two-boat race. The winner of the American trials
Okay.
versus the winner of the British trials.
Okay.
And then in the final races, which are offshore, they aren't in the harbor, they're in a completely clear space out in Rhode Island Sound,
Okay.
which is south of Newport, quite a ways out, so that there aren't any tide or wind issues.
Okay.
The local knowledge really doesn't mean a whole lot.
So it's a straight race.
It's a straight race, and it's the best 4 out of 7. It was what's called an Olympic course at that,
Okay.
and so we raced. Turns out that we won 4-0 both years,
Oh, wow.
but
Pretty dominant.
it's best 4 out of 7.
Okay. So you have 4 and
Right.
out, basically.
Right.
So, okay, so that was quite an experience. So you graduated from law school. You went to and where did you go from there? You got married. You got married while you were in law school.
So I had never. It turns out that because of the sailing, I had never had a summer job.
Okay.
Every summer, one way or the other, I was sailing, doing something.
Okay.
And so I'd never had a summer job. I'd had sailing related jobs, but I was also very careful not to ruin my Olympic eligibility, because some friends of mine and I were very seriously interested in an Olympic campaign, and it turns out that the person that I would have done this with developed a spinal injury and became paralyzed. So that didn't work. We never did that. But
in what were you going to be in the Olympics in? Yachting?
well, I mean, I would have been in the Olympics if we made it.
Yeah, but what were you endeavoring to?
In a keel boat called a dragon,
Which is
and it's no longer raced.
okay. That's why I was struggling to come up with what you were
It's a very pretty classic keel boat and
sailing.
sailing boat.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So
That was we had sailed against a lot of people who had been in the Olympics and had
Okay.
won medals, and we were certainly in their league. Whether or not, when you're at that level, you could either do well or not.
It's hit or miss.
Depending upon what is, particularly in sailing, you have to realize that the wind could shift on you or something could break.
that's a good point. Yeah.
It's somewhat problematic.
Yeah.
So that was simply a dream, which by no matter of means did I pursue that, because my friend had developed this injury which disqualified him and disqualified me in the process.
Okay. So you mentioned you hadn't worked much during.
So I'd never worked, and I thought to myself that I had the wonderful luxury, or Nanny and I, by now we were married, had the wonderful luxury of choosing where we wanted to live. And we looked at a map and thought, do we want to go to San Francisco? Do we want to go to Anchorage? Do we want to go to, where do we want to go?
Yeah.
And finally, we decided that we'd like to be in one of 3 places that we thought were really beautiful. We thought Connecticut. We now lived in Connecticut. We were familiar with that. The idea of living in a place like Guilford and having a dock and a boat, that was an appeal, but we couldn't afford that. But we thought, who knows what.
If you're in the neighborhood, maybe it'll happen.
Or maybe Wilmington, Delaware, which has a very sophisticated corporate practice.
Okay.
Or Portland, Maine, where Maine has so many attractions that we loved. Well, the problem with Wilmington was, at the end of the day, in Wilmington, we thought, this is probably totally wrong, but we thought at the time, either you're a DuPont or you're not a DuPont. We envisioned being part of a community in which we could expect to get to know the leaders of the community and maybe have a role in the community. So Wilmington, in spite of its very sophisticated law practice, didn't appeal.
Seemed a little
Portland had everything that we wanted, but the practice, I thought, again, this is maybe totally wrong, but at that time, I thought, well, it's not as sophisticated a practice as I wanted.
Right.
Connecticut was wonderful. We couldn't afford the house in Guilford with the dock.
Right.
And Hartford, at that point, had a kind of bustle and swagger and sophistication about it that really appealed to us.
Okay.
And we thought it would be wonderful to live in the country.
Okay.
So I interviewed at a couple of law firms and fell in love with Shipman and Goodwin, which was the firm that I ultimately went to.
Okay.
So without really being particularly careful in the interviewing process, I accepted their offer when it was made. I think they were a little unsure about me because they thought all of my sailing activity might
You weren't going to
indicate
stick
that I'm
around.
militant, that I really wasn't going to focus on
Right.
the practice of law, which I hope wasn't the case.
Right.
But I just loved the firm and thought, why keep looking? I'll just get right to the point and accept.
Okay. So you get the job, you got the offer,
Yeah.
and you started. What type of law did you practice? Business law? Corporate?
Well, I represent in time. I represented Lego, for instance, the toy maker. I was there. I was the lead counsel, North American lead counsel, I guess you could say.
Okay.
And I did that for a long time. Spent quite a lot of time in Europe when I was doing that. And then I was very active in corporate trust work all over the country, representing institutional trustees of one sort or another in leveraged lease financing transactions and all sorts of other debt issuances, escrow agreements.
Fairly complicated corporate type law.
But great fun.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Now
I love that.
you did. Now, how did you end up in Granby? You got the job, and where did you go from there?
So we knew that we wanted to be in the country.
Okay.
We had seen a couple of houses in Granby, but we just thought Granby was way too far away.
Couldn't get further from the shore in Connecticut. That's
Well,
Not that it's
we just thought that there must be some country place where we could live. And then Nanny saw an ad for, I think it said a country camp in West Granby.
okay.
And Nanny thought, that's an intriguing description. I wonder
A
what
real
that's
estate
all
listing.
about. It was a real estate
Oh,
listing.
okay. All right.
But, for a country camp in West
Yeah.
Granby. So we came out and just loved it. The people that were showing it did all of the things that they say you do if you want to sell a house. So,
Yeah.
they were cooking
That's what I was going to say.
fresh bread, and they had flowers on the table.
You could not buy it.
Oh, it was great, and we've just loved it. So we've lived there.
Was it summer?
I think we saw it in maybe February, and
Okay, so it was midwinter.
ended closing in March or April or something like that.
Okay. That part of
very quick.
That part of the town is beautiful, no matter what time of
It
year
is.
it is. Yeah.
And we've been very active in the town.
Yeah.
It turns out that I was a selectman, I think within 9 months of moving into town.
Really? Wow.
And so I filled out a vacancy.
Okay.
I had gone to volunteer at some campaign and had gotten in a heated argument with a selectman whose name I can't remember, who was a professor at UConn.
Okay.
And he and I disagreed on some
Point.
political point. I don't remember what it was. Turns out that he then was transferred, I think, to Pomona College in California, or got another job.
Okay.
And he recommended that I fill his slot, which came as a great surprise to me.
Yeah.
So I did that for the remainder of that term, and then I ran for one other term.
Okay.
I really wanted to be on the Planning and Zoning Commission because that's the body that has so much to do with what the town will look like
Character.
long term. But people correctly said, you have some dues to pay here. You can't just come waltzing in and be on the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Yeah.
Do your duty first. So finally, I did go on the Planning and Zoning Commission, and I was on that for 36 years.
Wow.
And at the end, I had been named the probate judge in Granby after I retired from, or in the process of retiring from Shipman and Goodwin. I threw my hat in the probate ring
Okay.
and ended up winning that. And so there was a small overlap between the time that I was officially moving out of Shipman and Goodwin and still on the Planning and Zoning Commission and moving into the probate slot. So for a year or so, I was both on the Planning and Zoning Commission and the probate judge at the same time. Under the probate ethics rules, I could continue to serve on the Planning and Zoning term that I had already been elected to.
Right.
But as a probate judge, I couldn't myself run in an election.
Okay.
So I had to resign from the Planning and Zoning Commission.
So that was quite a run, though. I mean, that was quite a span when you were actually part of that. Now, before I forget, because we jumped right into your civic life here in Granby, you have two children.
We have two children,
and
right.
Their names are?
Nanny is the oldest one,
Nanny.
who is going to be in October 44.
Okay.
And we have the younger one who is going to be 40, well, in fact, just was on July 30th, 42.
Okay.
Nanny is a teacher.
And the other one is Allison.
And the other one is Allison.
Okay.
Allison is the Director of Research Compliance at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston.
Okay.
And then we have 5 grandchildren.
Okay, you want to rattle off their names? This is always a test.
Sure.
It's like,
Elias, Rawson, and Ava are Nanny's children.
okay.
Elias is 17,
Okay.
junior in high school, going into senior. And then Silas and Tucker are Allison's. They're much younger,
Yeah.
7 and 4.
You have affinity for unique names in your family.
We do. Well,
which is fun. No judgment.
well, Rawson was I told you about my
Yeah.
grandmother who lived on Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah.
Her maiden name was Rawson, and she was
Okay.
a much beloved character in our family.
It just struck me. It must be tough when you're at Hershey Park trying to buy key tags for these. It's not easy, right? Inevitably, somebody gets left out there.
Right.
Okay, so now we can get back to your run. You were on Planning and Zoning for an extended period of time. Now, in that cycle, what are the biggest changes you've seen in town?
Well, certainly the loss of farms has been rather dramatic.
Okay.
And I think also one of the things that worries me is that there isn't as much economic diversity in the new housing stock as there was when we moved. One of the great appeals of Granby when we moved was that you might have the bank president living next to the plumber who lived next to, there was just a diversity of people, different kinds of lifestyles, all of whom came together and loved Granby without an undue concern about status,
Right.
or social position or economic position.
Right.
Given the economics of what it costs to build or buy a house now, it's difficult here and virtually every place else to maintain that kind of diversity which we loved. You still find that diversity in cities,
Yeah.
but in suburban communities,
By default,
you don't
yeah.
as much.
Yeah.
And Granby, when we moved here, had a much wider economic and social diversity, I think, than it does now.
Would you say that mirrors the stratification in America?
I do. I think so.
Yeah.
And it's a disturbing trend.
Yeah, I would agree. So you've seen that kind of become more pronounced in town, and that concerns you. Any other changes that you've noticed that? I mean, that's a pretty big one. So you start to see that kind of shift.
I can't say there are changes that are different in Granby than other places.
Okay.
But there are a couple of things that concern me about our society. I worry about the excessive glory of organized youth sports.
Okay. There certainly is. With a 9-year-old son, I can say there's no shortage of.
Well,
Yeah.
and I can understand many of the forces that lead to that.
Right.
I mean, when the parents take their children or watch their children at organized sports, it's where they socialize. It's
Right.
important that many of the skills that you learn as a member of an organized team are very important, but there isn't much time for children to cope with the potential of boredom. And one of the reasons that Nanny and I moved to West Granby, into a relatively remote part of town, was that we wanted our children to have to cope on their own, make up things to do. And I think that was very good for them. So when they were growing up, we didn't have television, for instance, for 8 or 10 years.
Yeah.
And we raised milking goats, so the whole family would be part of the milking operation. But I think it was important to the development of who those children became, of the women that they became, that they learned how to amuse themselves, how to do things on their own. So I worry about the effects of having too many closely coordinated activities that of necessity involve the parents as much as they do.
Right. I can see that. Having, like I said, I have a 9-year-old son.
There's no simple way to look at it, no correct way. There are pluses and minuses.
I agree.
But it does worry me that overall we aren't allowing our children to be as self-reliant as perhaps I think.
So the
they should.
exaggerated organization, you think there's something that's lost with that?
I do, and it's a trend not only in Granby, but everywhere else.
Self-reflection
That
is a
worries me.
valuable tool to carry through life.
I think so.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So is there anything in those years, any decisions, this is a loaded question, anything that you think could have been done differently or you would have liked in hindsight that you think was for better or worse? I'm not necessarily...
On the Planning and Zoning Commission?
Yeah, is there any changes is there anything that you would have redone or focused on more? Or?
I don't think so. I'm very proud of what the Planning and Zoning Commission did.
Okay.
I think we were always mindful of the fact that we were creatures of the laws that the state imposes on us statutorily,
Right.
and the regulations that we adopt ourselves. So we weren't philosopher kings. I mean,
Right.
you couldn't come in with a proposal to build such and such a house in a way that would allow us to say, no, I don't like that design. That doesn't work for me aesthetically. I want my house, I want Granby to look like something.
Right.
So there are a lot of houses, I'm sure, or buildings that people may think don't meet their aesthetic standards. But this is not a police state, and we have to be very careful about exercising our jurisdiction in ways that are legal and constitutional.
I was on Planning and Zoning in East Granby for a short time, and I'm on the Wetlands Commission now, and I always joke with people, if you comply, you can't deny. You know,
Right.
if people go to the level of
And that's an
compliance,
important principle.
It is, yeah.
So I'm actually very proud of what the Planning and Zoning Commission accomplished. We never, I think maybe the Planning and Zoning was sued once or twice in my 36 years.
That's a pretty good record.
And those suits never went to trial. They were dropped.
Right.
That's a pretty remarkable standard.
Sure it is,
I
especially
think
through the development that was going on.
Yeah, and I think it reflects the fact that the members of the Planning and Zoning Commission, under the leadership of the people who were chairman from time to time, treated people with respect and remembered the limitations of their power. I think our regulations were in many ways models that other people in the state have looked at.
Okay.
And the other thing that really impressed me about the public hearings that were held was how very thoughtful and surprisingly articulate the people were who came before the commission. There just were not people who came out and yelled or got off track. People were respectful of the commission and addressed issues that really mattered under the regulations and were involved in community dialogues that really reflected very well on the town.
So you felt it was a thoughtful process.
I really do.
Yeah.
I was really very pleased with that. And the same was true in my experiences as probate judge.
That's a much more personal.
It is. But I was really most impressed by the people that I dealt with. And as a probate judge, you deal with people who are dealing with some of the most difficult, emotionally draining issues imaginable. I mean, imagine having a will contest where you're pitted against your brother, or you're dealing with a parent who may need a conservator. He or she is, not managing his or her affairs in a way that's appropriate. Here you're dealing with taking away many of the aspects of a person's individual liberty and dignity in the name of some greater good. That's really excruciatingly difficult. But the system works, At least it did, insofar as I watched it.
Well, it's nice to hear that you had such a satisfying experience in that post, because I know that is one of the places that many people find themselves and aren't prepared for. I mean, it's not something you think through.
Right.
You may make out a will, or you may have a thought of end-of-life care and those sorts of things, but sometimes it's not always that smooth, and somebody has to make a judgment. That's remarkable that you could come out of it feeling so good about it.
And there are no easy answers. For instance, one of the things that the probate courts have power over are end-of-life decisions.
Right.
Well, in the final analysis, when it's all done, you know what you should have done. The person died and didn't recover, and therefore we should have, allowed the person to die early.
Right.
But at the time,
you don't
know how it's all going to turn out, and it's excruciatingly anguishing for everybody involved.
I can imagine. To keep your head through that process is something that must take some practice.
Right.
Anyway, we've quickly run to the end of our hour here, but I have one question left that I'd like to ask you. And that is, it's a question, well, first of all, let me give you a brief moment. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about tonight that you don't feel like you touched?
Not that I can think of.
Okay.
Thank you.
There was no plan, so it was a pretty loose interaction. But I always ask folks, if you could give advice to young people growing up today, one piece of advice that your sage-like experience from your years would bring to bear, what would that advice be to your grandchildren, or to other children, maybe not specifically yours?
I think it would be allow your life to be ruled by what really matters to you. And making a lot of money shouldn't really matter to you. But if you can find something that deeply engages you, do that, and do the best job you possibly can. If it turns out that means that you're sweeping floors, sweep them better than anybody else has ever swept them. You see an awful lot of people who come back from work and they say, I hate it. That just should never happen.
No way to go through life.
No.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight, Daniel. Today, thank you for just referred to you as Daniel, because I was going to.
That's all right. I am. That's who I am.
Daniel Putnam Brown was our guest this evening. Most of you will know him as Putt, and he goes by that name. And today's date, once again, is August 4th, 2012. We thank you for joining us on Reflections on Granby. And once again, you can view our show weekly Friday nights at 8 p.m. on GCTV, Channel 16, or you can pull it up at www.gctv16.org. And we thank you once again for joining us. Thanks, Putt.